once we start.
Good morning. Good morning. Let's get started. I am impressed and pleased that so many of you actually made it after last night. Although it wasn't, we didn't stay out that late, did we? It
No,
seems
but
like
we drank a lot.
Well, we did. We did. I should perhaps let Ed finish his introduction because I don't have one, but I won't. You know, Ed, because I have to introduce Antoine, who it would be difficult, so I'm not going to try. I would like to say something about Lisa Haber Thompson, because today we're talking about online learning. And Lisa, though we know her, of course, well as a PhD candidate here, what you may not know, she was in the college in VES before she came to the GSD, and in between VES, and already at VES, she worked with Rob Moss, the filmmaker, and Peter Gallison. But then in between VES and GSD, she worked at WGBH doing documentary film.
Low-budget educational video production.
Low-budget educational video production. I should have said.
It's less cool.
But she also had a chance to work with Errol Morris, and I'm hoping you'll see a bit of influence. No?
Oh, influence? Maybe.
No, Errol Morris and Fred Weissman. So, and she produced the GSD's first online course, which will be the subject of her presentation. So Lisa will start, Antoine then will present. And we are today, just maybe we didn't emphasize enough yesterday, we really wanted the format of this to be different from a sort of giving presentations and then asking questions. We really want it to be a conversation. So to the extent possible, let's try to, and Antoine can help us steer it in that direction as well. Lisa.
Okay. All right, but I'm still going to read from my paper.
Okay.
All right, thanks. Thanks for inviting me. When I spoke to Antoine about the theme of this conference a few weeks ago,
Slow down.
All right. He asked me to speak to what teaching a history and theory of architecture in the digital age might look like. He was interested, he said, in what will we still be doing in the physical world. That's a direct quote.
Well, next time, remind me not to talk to you.
It's easy, of course, to evaporate the physicality of the internet, even though we know that we shouldn't. So even if the distance and distance learning is traversed through dematerialized ones and zeros conveyed over the interwebs, both the production and the reception of an online course are very much occurring in the real world. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. I think one thing that's revealed immediately is that this digital-physical divide is not actually a binary one, and so maybe that's something to keep in mind. So for the better part of the past couple of years, I've been involved in the GSD's first co-production with edX, as Michael mentioned, the online platform that was founded jointly by MIT and Harvard in 2012. So from this vantage point on the inside of the sausage factory, I'm going to take this opportunity to share a little bit about what does in fact happen in the physical world when it comes to producing an online course. So I'm going to use examples from this course, but throughout I think we should try to extrapolate as much as possible, and I'm not going to talk about the content. I'd like instead to talk about the form. What form does a course on the history of architecture take when it's distributed online? What are the parameters of this new form of teaching? And more generally, how can we use these tools, and should we even use them to frame and reframe our discourse? The larger argument is that the medium of teaching matters, as it always has, whether it coalesces online or whether it takes the form of a more traditional survey lecture course at a brick-and-mortar university. So hopefully by talking about this, it can help. We can also talk about how we teach in person, I guess, which is, I know what Antoine actually meant when he said what will he still be doing in the physical world. The form of an online class doesn't just take the form of recorded lectures streamed online. It's a whole platform that involves a whole bunch of things, and we don't have time to talk about all of them, but I'm going to talk about these 4 things: the lectures themselves, the labor that goes into producing them, the assessment of students and how you evaluate students, and then the audience, or who's watching. For each of these parts, we had to make deliberate decisions based on specific parameters of the medium, decisions that really pushed us, I think, to think more generally about how architecture is taught. And maybe that's what we can talk about with Michael Okay. So I'm going to start by talking about the lectures, which are maybe the most visible part of this whole thing. In his manifesto-like notes on cinematography, the filmmaker Robert Bresson articulates what he found fundamental to the particularities of his craft. In these short paragraphs, a reoccurring theme surfaces. What does the art of film express that others can't, and how can a filmmaker harness these powers? For Bresson, a film is analogous to and uses methods or parts of other arts, yet remains fundamentally separate from them. He writes, on 2 deaths and 3 births, a movie is first born in my head, dies on paper, is resuscitated by the living persons and real objects that I use, which are killed on film, but placed in a certain order and projected onto a screen, come to life again. I had a clip of this, but then I realized that that would be a death I would not be able to
We're ready to
resuscitate.
give you 5 more minutes,
Really?
provided that you slow down a little bit.
Ah, okay. I
You
only have 5 more minutes?
You have 5
We
more
will give
minutes.
you extra-
So just slow down.
Ah,
So
okay.
you don't add
extra
anything.
time.
You don't add anything, but you slow down.
Way too
Oh,
fast.
I didn't know. Okay, I will.
Okay, don't forget that some of us have a difficult relation with English.
Ah, okay. All right. All right, Bresson, 2 births, 3 deaths, killing and rebirths. So I'm bringing up Bresson not to say that digital education needs to be more film-like, although certain aspects of it uses techniques from film and video production, itself 2 different mediums, but rather to call attention to the ways in which producing and streaming video lectures is fundamentally different from producing and experiencing brick-and-mortar university lectures. In other words, you can't just record a lecture and stream it online and expect the same thing, and I think that's kind of like Media Studies 101. We need to understand both the constraints along with the possibilities in order to make successful work. So to us, that was important when we were thinking about how we're going to produce these lectures. So obvious things like when you have a live lecture, there's a community of students that come together in a place and watch someone on stage deliver live content and construct an argument versus the online course where you're sitting alone in your room watching the same thing. So it's not the same way of experiencing that and producing it. I think Michael and Antoine and Erica can probably speak to what it's like to being in front of a camera, giving a lecture, and you could probably also say that's not the same thing as being in front of an audience. So we thought carefully about how we wanted to present the lectures, and existing online courses have taken a variety of approaches. I brought a couple of examples. This is an example from a course in early modern England.
Right, so this is History 251, and this.
All right, we don't actually need to listen to it. But that is pretty much at one end of the spectrum and pretty much follows the camera in the back of the classroom model. No one else has ever shown, I'm not sure why.
Right.
Okay. All right, well, that was that. No one else is ever shown. Even when the professor introduces the teaching fellows, they're not shown on screen. The only concession, I think, that you can see given to the streaming nature of the course seems to be that he's wearing a lavalier mic, and that's pretty much the only thing. This is an example of a different model. This is from Michael Sandel's Justice course.
Would it be just to torture the suspect?
Which takes the form of a more TED Talks model, complete with a charismatic figure occupying the width of the stage, and cutaways to students having the emotional reactions to the realization that they, too, would not push the fat man over the bridge, even if it meant 50 people dying. So that's the TED Talks model, and we decided not to do that, although I think your charisma probably equals Michael Sandel's charisma. So we opted for a third option. Are you all right if I don't play the sound on this? Okay.
I'm perfectly all
Yeah,
right.
that's. Well, I have to say he has blue eyes. That's a big advantage. Gosh.
We set up deliberate sets for each lecture and thought carefully about how each would be framed. And for each lecture, we set up in a different way depending on the theme of the lecture itself. Well, I'm going to get back to talking about this, the animations in a bit. For this lecture, it was about Eisenman's Holocaust Memorial, and so we thought about setting it in a situation that would be full of concrete and that would be abstract, that you could see the texture of the material, but that wasn't necessary because we weren't going to be actually shooting on site, but that it was important that the setting somehow reflected in some way the content that was being delivered. When we shot Antoine's lecture about the Crystal Palace, we had a projection of the Crystal Palace in the back, which is sort of like an evocation of this dematerialized building that no longer exists. We shot the Pompidou lecture on the trays with a short focal length so that the tubing of the things would sort of echo the infrastructural stuff of Pompidou. So
The
that.
Corbusier.
The Corbusier we shot, which we're having copyright issues about, by the way.
We shot in front of a tapestry in special collections. Now we have
Yeah.
copyright issues. Yeah.
Okay, so we set up these deliberate sets for each lecture and thought carefully about how each would be framed. From my point of view, this was a little bit, it made it easier. I knew it was going to make it easier to edit later, so that was a big reason for it. It's always easier to deal with continuity issues when you're not moving the camera and when you can control as much as possible. I think also for the speaker, it's easier to not have to continuously reorient your body towards the camera if there's any way that the camera is fixed or stationary. Like Michael knew where to look, where the camera was, where I would be. Erica's shaking her head. Are you having flashbacks?
I am.
Okay. Okay, so technically I think it was easier and cleaner, but for me also ideologically it seemed important to reveal the artifice or the construction of the situation. We weren't pretending that this was real life or just happening, but rather that each lecture is a highly constructed piece that incorporated the performance of the professor, the construction of his argument, along with the materials that were collected in support of that argument. So to me, that was a really important part of the way that these things were developed. We were also really conscious of the images and the other footage that we used to illustrate the lectures. Each of these lectures were developed from in-person lectures, and I had a slide deck of about 30 or so slides from each lecture that got transformed or fleshed out into several hundred images or animations or clips of archival footage, partly because of the way that you watch on screen. Like, you can't watch 2 minutes of a stationary thing on screen because you would just turn it off. Like, people don't watch TV or images that way anymore. But also because it seemed like a way to take advantage of the kind of images and the kind of ways of looking at architecture that are already part of what we do when we're talking about architecture. And I think that this makes architecture easier than maybe some other online courses because we actually have stuff to look at. We didn't really have to try too hard to think about what that was. We allowed ourselves to be pretty loose about what kinds of things we'd use. So we did some things like the stop motion animations of the situation maps, for example. This is like a really quick and dirty thing. It took just a couple hours in the studio. Tyree map off eBay kind of thing. We also, I tried to find archival footage as much as possible, along with actual images of the buildings. So all of these things were carefully considered when we were.
This was the Bitburg controversy, which we used to introduce the Holocaust Memorial.
Yeah. And then I can talk a little bit about how it was edited, but maybe I'm going to skip that for right now. It's important also to note that the time it takes to make this kind of thing. John May 2 days ago gave a lecture about time it takes, so I thought it would be useful to see this. For a 40-minute lecture, this is not even counting the time it takes Michael and Eric Antoine to prepare the lecture. There's a lot of stuff that goes into preparing it. So before you have to do location scouting, you have to meet with a videographer and building supervisor. You have to meet with the faculty to review the script and the setup. On the day of, you have to meet with the crew beforehand, early in the morning, usually around 7, set up, do a rough block of the lighting, set up the mics, the talent arrives, finalize mic, and that's an industry standard, although Michael is very talented, but finalize the lighting. The shoot itself for a 40-minute segment will take between 3 and 4 hours. Afterwards, the talent leaves, we break down the set, we catalog the footage and back it all up. In the weeks after, you do a first radio edit, which is sort of getting the content together without thinking about any kind of B-roll. You review that content with the faculty to make sure everything's okay. Sometimes I skip that step. I'd have a production meeting with the animator, other people that are doing research. Then we'd all research, collect, and catalog additional B-roll materials, rough cut everything together with a B-roll, fine cut everything with translate and proof text and transitions between the videos, finally review with the faculty. After that, do a final cut, then update the asset spreadsheet where we're tracking all the images, review the question assets with our IP lawyer and replace the problematic ones, Finally, the post-production, which we did at HarvardX, I didn't do that, the color and sound corrections. Finally, we create the credits and do a final review, export, upload, all that. And so that's weeks and months of stuff after just that 40 minutes to produce a 40-minute thing.
Could I just, maybe you talk about this later, the copyright issues.
No, I'm going to talk about it later.
Sorry,
Michael,
sorry.
you're not presenting.
Okay.
All right, so that's the lecture. All right, so I'm going to talk about labor. So you probably noticed in that last little bit about how much non-Michael time was involved in a lecture that was Michael's. In mounting this kind of production, you're necessarily be involved with a whole new cast of characters, each from within her own professional sphere. So I think in this respect, more than any other, the online course reveals structures of labor in university that we might otherwise take for granted. The lecture course at a brick and mortar relies not only on teaching faculty, but also on a rotating cadre of graduate students to grade papers and organize sections, on university administrators to enroll students and give the course a reliable and regular audience, on the building people that set up the classrooms, among many others. None of those things exist in an online course, but rather than evaporating all of that, it just relies on a different set of practices and a different way of organizing, sometimes the same people, sometimes new people. Understanding and respecting the parameters within which all of these professionals work is, I think, critical to mounting a successful production. And that is from anything from like the building supers that let us shoot, like the building supers in the Carpenter Center that we had a good relationship with, and when I could ask them to turn off the air so that it wouldn't, to all the way to the people who are handling the color correction at HarvardX. A lot of this is pretty standard across just general production, but some of this we really relied on people who had a very particular type of expertise. And I think one of the best examples of this is our chief animator, Helen Hahn, who is not only a talented video artist and animator, but she also studied architecture here at the GSD with Michael and Antoine. I think she left right before Eric was here. This made a difference because we were able to entrust to her certain things that needed to be shown without really having to talk about it and without having to translate into her words what would need to happen. She produced work that wouldn't have been possible, in other words, if she hadn't already been fluent in the particular kind of architectural discourse that goes on around here. So on top of her technical abilities, I was basically able to hand her certain things and be like, Michael's not really being clear, like, can you do something about this? And then we'd get that, which not only helped clarify the point, but also I think makes compelling arguments for certain ways of moving the space in this example Michael's trying to make. So that's the production, some of the production things. The next two things I'm going to talk very quickly about because we don't really have the data back yet, or not data, but we don't know yet how this is going to work. And this is about the assessments and then the audience. So while the video lectures are important, the production, as I mentioned, of an online class is not just about these lectures. A major challenge we had to address was how to think about student assessments and feedback, given that the structure of MOOCs does not allow for individuated feedback from instructor to student. For most online courses, assessments are either those that can be automated by a computer, like multiple choice, one-word answer, etc., or in those longer form essays that cannot be graded by computer, they normally operate on a peer graded model for people that are paying for their certificate track. So a lot of the courses on the edX and Coursera platforms are STEM courses in computer science. I was trying to think about this. I mean, maybe you can speak to this, but I was thinking at first that, it's easier to grade a science class with yes or no, but I don't actually think that's true. They probably have their own question, so yeah. Anyway, the basic question we have to ask when we're talking about architecture is how you evaluate student work when the scale of operations is such that individual attention is not possible. And that was the basic question. But through thinking through this, it led to more fundamental questions about how best to help students learn, engage with material. How can you build rubrics that actually help students learn concepts when they're in architecture school and they're up all night and they're not awake during VTC? And develop arguments and go through readings and all this stuff. Like, how do you do that in a way that's helpful? So I think we can come back to that in a little bit. It's hard to know how it's working because the course just opened on Tuesday, and apparently it's not, so I asked them, can we get the feedback from the essays? And they were like, no, why would you want that? And it was like, well, because no one's seen this essay prompt except for Michael and I need to know if it makes sense. And so they were like, well, okay, we can export something, and it literally comes out in like a spreadsheet. So I have to deal with that somehow. So that's it. I think we can come back to that. My final point is about discourse and audience. And it became really clear when producing this class that an audience that we had been assuming was not, in fact, the audience that we got. I was making a joke to a friend of mine that it was like as if we had been working for 3 years making like a special edition of Grey Room or something like that. And then it turned out that it was actually being sold in the airport bookstore about a month before it opened. Oops. Ed, you said that I was cool last night. I am about to prove definitively that I'm not. So unfortunately, I think that means you're not cool either. So there were 3 things that we did not take into consideration when we opened this class, and I think that this might be just different for every course, but it seems to be an enormous, I always wanted to be an architect when I was young factor. I always wanted to be a paleontologist when I was young, so I truly don't understand that mindset. I don't know why you'd want to be an architect. Another thing that happened is apparently a famous Brazilian tweeted about the edX platform, and then a week later, an Arc Daily article about the course got translated into Portuguese. So now a quarter of our students are from Belo Horizonte, and now we know you're the famous Brazilian.
Marina got us about 50,000 people, I think. How many from Brazil? It exploded in 1 week. Mm-hmm. Everybody from Brazil signed up. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, sure. And then apparently there's a lot of people that do these things like video games, and I'm calling them the cheaters and the non-writers. And it's breaking my heart because they're not going to learn anything. So.
You can game the
Why?
answers, yeah.
Anyway, so I think that's interesting to take into account, because I think that the next time you'd make something like this, it would be a whole new set of things that you wouldn't necessarily have thought of unless you're a sociologist and you actually study this kind of thing, which I'm not. Okay, and finally, I'm one of those people who believe in the instructive power of failure. So in conclusion, I'm going to share an example of one of my own. A few years back, when Michael was preparing to make the announcement that the internal course he had developed here with our colleagues Marika Trotter and Peter Seeley would be reworked to be offered through the edX platform, he asked Helen and I to come up with a trailer that he could show people at the GSD to garner interest and support for the project.
Architecture's
No,
need
stop.
for shelf
No, it's good sound.
function.
Okay, so the idea behind this trailer was pretty simple. It aimed to make visible two perhaps competing forms of seeing architecture. The collection of 35mm slides references the lecture hall survey course, prior to which a professor would sort through her slides to prepare the carousel. However, we are presenting these slides within a kind of motion of mechanistic scanning in reference to the ways in which images are searched and scanned over the internet.
Study of architecture.
Like everything else at Harvard X, the final gatekeeper before anything goes live is not the faculty, but rather the in-house intellectual property lawyer. While to me this trailer was a very explicit comment on the negotiation between an older and newer form of teaching architecture, what the IP lawyer saw, of course, was 148 individual, unattributed, and unverifiable image assets. He asked me to secure licensing information for each image. I replied that this information was not available, as these slides were deaccessioned from the library, in many cases with missing or illegible tags. I argued that instead I'd like to make a case for pedagogical transformative fair use. In aggregate, the deaccession slides operated as indices of a former method of teaching, that this rarefied set of images in collection were now being explicitly situated and reframed for an internet audience, and that this montage therefore aimed to reveal the ways in which architectural history is always framed by the media through which we frame it. All right, I stopped that. The lawyer got back to me. Dear Lisa, while I love the slide motif, I'm not sure the pedagogical argument you are making is explicit or clear enough to make a fair use claim in this way. If you do not have rights holder information for the images, we cannot use them. Do you need these slides? Perhaps you can cut this out and replace best Brad. Finally capitulating, as time was pressing, I proceeded to spend an incredibly tedious and painful evening photoshopping verified copyright cleared images into the original After Effects layers, an evening made even more painful by the realization that if Brad, the copyright lawyer, didn't buy the argument, he's an intelligent and nice guy after all, who had given us the benefit of the doubt more often than not, that most likely the point I thought we were making, that the medium of architecture itself and its historical discourse has always been constructed through different forms of presentation and representation. In other words, about the course itself being kind of a strange hybrid medium, that this point would be lost on pretty much everyone, with maybe perhaps the exception of the people in this room. My consolation will have to be that if nothing else, this course and this conversation might allow us to open up the conversation for what the forms themselves of these new digital teaching tools might afford and what they might not. I think this will inevitably require rethinking the presentation of our material, rethinking the assessments of students, rethinking the construction of our audience, and rethinking the labor practices that underpin our university system. For all these things, I think it requires staking claims and making deliberate choices. And in our current era, it feels more important than ever to pay attention to the way that knowledge is constructed and presented, and to be deliberate in the way that we announce our work. The end. No one will ever now see this wonderful image person with squirrel in foreground, so I had to cut it out, unattributed.
Would you just say that you made the font for these? These are not actual slides.
Don't even.
These are constructed, and she made those fonts to construct them.
Some of them are real.
Well,
Okay.
I won't.
Thank you. I'll be shorter. First thing, of course, what I find always interesting that, there are probably two laboratories of future digital life. One is the city and the other is higher education. And I'm always struck by how higher education is actually getting more and more impact. And it's clear for me that theory and history will be confronted to the rise of what is often called the digital humanities. So this presents a number of consequences in terms of research and teaching. For example, and I'm glad you came before, because the possibility of using more extensively animated images and simulation, we're just beginning to do that, actually. And it's very striking because so far in most history theory classes, the fixed image, the static image was dominant. So this is a big change. Even if there's some, we could show movie now and then, etc., it was relatively rare compared to the rest. Another thing for me is the possibility to integrate sound, which will come. And whoever has made the experience of an anechoic chamber, I really remember once I went to the Beaubourg, the sound facility there, and they have this amazing room in which you can completely change the reverberation of the room, and you pass from a salon to a cathedral in terms of the ambience. Very striking how sound is actually a very important aspect of the physical experience of space, and something we very rarely take into account in history theory classes. And this is something we could do in the future. And it's, as I said, it's you can have the impression to be in a cathedral more vividly with sound than with a virtual reality helmet. So, in short, we can make theory and history more physical, more akin to an actual experience. So that's one trend. But another trend, which runs pretty much in the opposite direction, we can also make theory and history more open to number crunching. Quantitative aspects have not been the strong point of the discipline so far. This could change, contribute to for example, to a global history of circulation and exchanges in the architectural field, or even more evidently to a better articulation with the social sciences. So this articulation could be, by the way, I think I'm really struck by the fact that whether we like it or not, the social sciences are actually on the rise in design school. So the articulation between history theory and social sciences is probably one of the major challenges of the year to come. So we may have for that to use new tools, numbers, as I said, diagrams, maps, etc. In short, we've always thought of ourselves as part of the humanities. For me, the digital pushes us in two new domains. One is strangely artistic performance, And I didn't know that you called talent the person, but artistic performance might be something because we play more and more with things that are related to performance. And the second has to do actually with the social sciences. So in some ways we might become more artistic on the one hand, in the other hand closer to the social sciences. It might seem unrelated, but it's very striking by the way how in many places the arts and the social sciences are connecting very quickly. Bruno Latour launched a few years ago a program at Sciences Po on that question, and this is a pretty general evolution. Sociologists get interested in art, etc. So in a way, to use the ever-recurring expanded field notion, we might be running into a kind of expanded field in which we have to position ourselves vis-à-vis completely new set of discipline and practices from the arts to the social sciences. Another way to make sense of this evolution is to think of an activity like curating. We thought of ourselves most of the time in theory and history as writers. That was the dominant mode. We are perhaps turning into curators, and that's a very different form. So I would say artist, social scientist, curator, these are very different identities than that of the traditional theorist and historian. So that was the first set of remarks. Now I'd like actually to go to online, to the MOOCs, massive online, open online courses, because it's evidently one of the most pressing issues. It has become the new hot topic in higher education, and pretty much everywhere in the world, strategies are developed. Very often geo-strategies, for example, the Lausanne Polytechnic School, one of its big strategy these days is to produce MOOC for Africa, because of the French-speaking countries there. So they're trying to position themselves on this strategic slot, etc. So at the GSD, we have thanks to Michael and Lisa and others, finally one class. So it's probably too early to know what happened, and I found interesting that you had yet no clue completely on what will be the audience. But I would like to throw a few ideas and above all concern. I will be exaggerating these concerns so that things are clear. I participated to this MOOC, so I have nothing against MOOC, but I would like to exaggerate a little bit for the sake of the conversation, because they do correspond to real issue. First, and since we have many PhD students, I want to scare you about the evolution of the job market and the pyramid of competences. Yesterday we have fun, time to go back to the grim reality, and the pyramid of competences in theory, history, teaching. Like many aspects of digital culture, one thing is sure, Web 2.0 has promoted a winner-takes-all structure in which a selected happy few reach sufficient preeminence while others can barely make it. It's a very striking aspect of a lot of cultural scene these days, which have been really amplified by the Web 2.0. A few people make it and concentrate like super hubs, and the rest barely can survive. It's indeed then possible to imagine a dystopian scenario in which fully fledged professor will remain hired by wealthy and prestigious institutions, while others will subscribe to MOOCs, often given by these professors, and employ second-tiered instructor to provide the required assistance to students enrolled in MOOCs. In such a scenario, the theory history scene would lose part of its diversity, and above all, it will become polarized between a very selected few and a multitude, underpaid, of course, and that's something we see in a lot of domains today. So for me, there is a real job question behind that. The very nature of the MOOCs may very well reinforce this trend. For a MOOC is definitely not something, and there again, Lisa was, I think we complement each other pretty well. A MOOC is definitely not something as simple as someone getting behind a video camera and getting filmed while delivering some class on a given topic. We can do that, but let's be clear, I think there is no future for this kind of thing, except if you're Gilles Deleuze, an aging Gilles Deleuze, and you're chain smoking while talking about diagrams. But otherwise, you know, the level of sophistication of the MOOCs will actually make the professor behind his desk talking almost unbearable. So I think that's the truth. So because of these intrinsic requirements of teaching effectiveness and above all the increasing competition in the field, MOOCs will become more and more staged. They will mobilize a complex set of resources that it would be actually interesting to study using actor network theory. For once, I think it's a good subject. It's actually a good subject for ANT. You know, talent means camera, which meets with room, which meets with etc. And that becomes a complete network in which a lot of things and people have agency. In such a context, the professor become, depending on the situation, a complex mix of movie director, when he's really hands-on, and some professor I know, for example, at the law school are very directive, and star actor, talent, in proportion that may vary according to the circumstances. One thing is sure, the performance, which used to be relatively autonomous and requiring little exterior help, is now dependent upon a pyramid of competences and interventions. So there are various possibilities of evolution in such a context. One may see, for example, the reinforcements of the performing dimension of the contribution of the instructor, the professor again as a star actor. Another possible evolution has to do with a more and more managerial dimension of the work of the instructor, and the professor may become a manager of extended teams, including specialists of image and sound, designers of carefully crafted exercises. You have already firms which are selling you know, this kind of product. One thing is sure, this is no longer a field of amateur. And it's very striking, you know, a lot of discussion is going on the fact that Web 2.0 inaugurated the reign of the amateur. In teaching, in higher education, it might be the end of the amateur. So like many dystopian scenarios, nothing is written for good, and we may still change the course of evolution. So that's my hope moment. We may have to be creative and invent other forms of online teaching. For example, semi-open courses. At the law school, William Fisher has been running one of those on intellectual property for a few years, but actually with a very, very investment by himself. Interestingly, I talked to William Fisher. Fisher trains the people in charge of the support of his class in various foreign schools, and according to him, it actually boosts their career. So to have been a MOOC assistant in a remote school from Bulgaria to East Asia in his class, according to him, boosts is their career. Bobby Fischer has a strong ego, so I suppose it reverberates on his vision of what's happening. We may imagine also, talking about alternative product, the equivalent of YouTube posting, that it may develop. We don't have much of that yet, but a more lighter form of thing. But this diversification should not prevent us from asking ourselves a certain number of questions. First, I'm deeply perplexed about the exact nature of the pedagogic experience of online teaching. One of the reasons is we all know, for example, also that the kids do multitasking. So what happens if you have Spotify in a corner of the screen, Michael Hayes in the other? That's a very strange mix. In many respects, that said, the MOOC is an inheritor and an extension of the manual. And this explains the teaching manual. This explains, do you say manual in English? Yes. Manuel. Yeah. So this explains why it has been so much easier to adopt it in the exact sciences. You know, we're always wondering about, you know, the number of people enrolled in medicine or computer science, but actually, you know, manuals in computer science can sell by tens of thousands, and it has been that for a while. Actually, I would say the MOOCs proposes a strange hybrid between the manual and the class experience. The shift has also to do for me with the difference between movie and theater. You know, we used to be theater actor. We may become movie people. So what I find striking by the end, using this last analogy, is that the real difference is not so much the question of the disappearance of space, etc., than a different relation to body and time. And I was, we did not co-prepare, but I'm really struck by the question of time. But not only, by the way, the time of preparation, also the time of the psychological time involved in watching video. When we watch a film, we don't have the same relation to the body of the performer than when we see he, her on the stage. I'm always struck by the fact that watching a movie and watching bodies on a movie is not at all the same experience as going to the opera or the theater. So there is something different we haven't thought really completely through. In the latter case, it's clear that there is more evident empathy when you're physically co-present with a performer, but whereas, to use again a Deleuze kind of thing, cinema addresses our mind, our body through our minds. But above all, I'm really struck by the fact that time does not flow in the same way. And, including, by the way, the boringness of the class, which is part of the experience. Just like, for whoever had a religious education, being bored at the church or the temple or whatever, which is part of the experience. So to be slightly bored at moment when you listen to us, guys, is part of the teaching class experience. And you lose that with a video because you can just shut and restart whenever after have done. I know, I'm done. I'm gonna have half a page. So when we watch a film, so time does not flow in the same manner. So, which means, and to go back to this remarkable quotation that you took from me at the beginning, I do think that we have to really think very profoundly on what we do in the physical space, especially with our body and with time, and the time of teaching envisaged as a situated performance. And we're back to the notion, actually, of the artist. We might be forced also to become more and more like artists because it must be a meaningful performance. But we should not focus only on the historian, his body, his speech, his time, etc. But it's as much a question for the student. Once again, the digital might force us to rethink what students do, what expect from him in the class. For example, there are a number of experiments going on about students playing on the fact that students are usually consulting their mail, looking at the journal, or whatever. So could we use this kind of double presence online and in the physical world for a class? How do we harness that kind of thing? There are a number of experiments. So that actually a last possibility could be an augmented theory and history instead of only having an online and a physical modes. But nevertheless, in between the job market incertitude, etc., this, I do think it's a relatively urgent problem to begin thinking about seriously. And I'm done.
So we'll launch immediately into questions and comments.
Could I ask, just so that
Just for the video,
Yeah.
we need, yeah.
just so that we understand what you were trying to achieve, I know that the course came from something else. It's kind of like an architectural project in that sense that there's never a clear ground zero. But what were your ambitions for the course? What audience had you imagined? Apparently it's not the audience you had imagined that signed up for it. And particularly, I guess what I'm really interested in is how would the content for this course differ from the content you would present at GSD, for example, at a GSD course?
I have a public answer to the first part of that, how we conceived it. The truth is that we started to make a course that would satisfy the prerequisite for the MArcs admitted who had not had, especially a modern architecture course. Our teaching fellows, this goes back to the labor issue, this course will supplant a few teaching fellowships who taught in the summer. A lot of you did that, who taught in the summer basically a remedial course for people who hadn't had.
You're going to have a Luddite movement.
I know, I see them Ludditing as I speak.
Let's go and break Michael's office.
It was based, of course, on buildings, text, and context. But now the public answer that I tell is that we also found in the course that Teaching Fellows taught in the summer that people who went through that course, even though most of them had the least sort of architectural education, they hadn't even had the history course, they did better in buildings, text, and context than anyone else. And it was remarkable that I think it's not only that we have very good teaching fellows, it's the way we teach here is not the standard history course. It's really how do you think about architecture through history. Jorge, I hope we'll talk about this later on, even the history of that idea. How do you teach architects' history? How do you teach thinking about architecture? And it really is the course that we have online. It's based in history, but it's not chronological, and it's really about thinking architecture. So, and that, I think it's
But
that.
can I add something about the labor?
Yeah.
So Michael backpedaled because we had a conversation about it, and now we are keeping teaching fellows.
Yeah.
Because
We
it
will.
became very clear that, and goes back to my cheaters and scoundrels and non-writers, that people don't fill things out online when no one's watching them. And I don't think that they will learn as much, which makes me sad, if they don't have actual people with actual expertise interacting with them. So we did a almost immediate switcheroo, and I think that's really important to make that clear, that So.
I think the manual analogy can give you...
Or textbook.
The textbook, that's what I call the manual, sorry, the textbook. The textbook analogy enables you to realize the diversity of the audience, because a lot of people buy textbook and then don't read them. And, that's a little bit the problem of the MOOC. As a funny thing, just one thing, I received this morning, and I'm not inventing, someone who was at my table during the open house who didn't get admitted to the GSD, and she wrote to me, but fortunately I will be able to look at the MOOC, which I found strange and twisted, and nevertheless interesting.
Wait, I forgot to qualify that, so I sent Michael a text excitedly when we first opened saying, we have 364 people enrolled, exclamation point, and Michael sent me a text back that had the fire emoji. And now we have, that was 365 people. We now have over 95,000 people enrolled, of which 3,000 have paid $100. So this course has, in terms of revenue streams, and I think it's just important to put these numbers on the table.
Do you make any money out of it?
More than $250,000.
Wow.
I don't think I'm allowed to say that out. Shit.
I don't think you're allowed to say that.
Ezra wanted to
I'm
ask a
recorded.
question.
Yeah, but could I just say...
Sorry.
Okay.
But it's important to say that out loud.
Yeah, I know, but if we wanted
That's like
it
to Phil Medity over there. On the spot.
on the spot.
Ezra.
Ezra, microphone, and then Marika probably. You're actually a participant. That's good.
But I think this is, I think it's really, I'm glad you said that. I think there's the reality of the situation here, to sort of paraphrase Deleuze, is that a MOOC is a very efficient way to kind of monetize, to further monetize the higher education. And it becomes a way of even more completely delivering over the educational institution to the corporation. That has to be on the table.
Yes.
The other thing that I would say, though, is bearing that in mind, in what ways can, and here I think our going back to what you said yesterday, Michael, our disciplinary abilities or skills might help us. In what ways can we subvert that process? How can we actually take this different set of labor that's now been brought into the pedagogical arena and allow that different set of labor to free up other kinds of labor? Like maybe we can rethink what professors do. If your content is already being delivered via a whole other set of operations that have now been monetized in a different way, does that free you up to do other kinds of teaching that can supplant
Yeah.
and contradict and resist and blah, blah, blah. Like, let's be active about this. It's not just happening to us. We're participating in it.
Yeah. Go to Ezra, please. And just while the mic is passed, do the number to reach teaching at the rate of that we teach BTC. It would take 1,000 years to reach the numbers that.
But I mean, also,
1,000
like, I mean, like a
years.
lot of the people that are watching, like, first of all, like
90,000
whether or
to
not
90.
these 95,000 people are actually going to be watching these things, but keep in mind that that is a certain number that has produced a certain amount of money for the university, given the GSD a certain amount of attention in terms of those people that are running those things. Whether or not they are actually going to be watching Michael talk about Kant is a totally different question. Maybe that's what you're talking about. And if we somehow swindle the world into thinking that they should pay $100 for that, and we can use it in order to produce other kinds of things, then maybe that's.
Lisa. Ezra.
In addition to the consequence on the job market that the MOOCs produce, I wonder if there's also something to be said about the consequences on the scholarship that this produces, especially in the format that you have chosen, which is big production, big crew, a successful production, as you said. It involves a lot of resources, a lot of time. So I think it's fair to assume that, given the amount of resources that it takes for the successful production, it's fair to assume that these lectures will be fixed for a long period of time. And for fields that are dynamic, especially something like global architecture history, which is a very dynamic field, a fixed lecture, to me, is also a little bit of a shortcutting of the scholarship and being able to integrate new scholarship into the lecture. So I wonder, the big production model has, is blocking the avenue for scholarship to be integrated. And also, I was wondering if you also considered other formats like live classes broadcasted to the world, where people around the world can also have an input for asking questions. I mean, rather than Harvard's teaching to the whole world, I wonder if there are other formats in digital learning that can integrate the world into the Harvard class rather than Harvard just teaching.
No, I think it's a good question because I actually think we're just at the beginning of the process. So nobody knows, for example, this frozen or not frozen content is going to be. It depends on what Marika said, the evolution of the teaching, the job itself. And that's why by the end, I think the job thing is a very important aspect. Which competences, how are they compensated, et cetera, is actually a huge problem in this. And I do agree, this is why I said we have to diversify the products. I do agree that we do have to diversify the product. That said, I believe that's, for example, I was at a Smart City conference in which Microsoft is doing these classes. Ironically, it was between Mexico and the US, and, the kids talk together and do projects, etc. Fine. But, right now, it's a kind of PR operation in most places in the world, and it's also a market.
Yeah.
So we're not, I think, Brian.
Actually, Patricio and then Brian.
Okay.
Patricio, yeah.
Point on the impact on the scholarship, but also in relation to the issue of copyright. That I was kind of struck when you mentioned that you use backgrounds to mediate with the fact that you didn't go to Berlin, because I would have expected that if anybody can translate their faculty to the actual site, it would be Harvard University, right? And I assumed that was a question of budgets and time, and which is perfectly fine. But given a state of affairs, and I'll use an example. The Barragan Foundation claims copyright of every single photograph you take of any Barragan work to this day. If you go to any Barragan work, you actually take a picture, they will actually claim copyright of that picture. Of course, the Barragan Foundation was not going to pursue you, but it will certainly pursue, Harvard University or the Museum of Modern Art. And that was the experience that we had personally with them. So in relation of starting to carve the field or the landscape in relation to copyrights and the availability and the usage of actual sites, I think would like to hear more sort of on that question and how this kind of new pedagogical experience really starts to, open or close accesses to the actual sites.
Can I answer real quick? I think to your point about the production value of this, it makes it seem like a lot, but it was actually fairly nimble production. Like we had one editor, and we shot on location. So in that sense, well, but so that's the thing. So I think that's why the textbook model makes more sense, because in terms of producing something, it remains fixed, but it's not a huge Hollywood operation. To the copyright question, it's definitely an issue, which you can use transformative fair use when you're talking about an image, and you can claim pedagogical fair use. That was my point about the slide.
That said, if I were to sue Harvard
Yeah.
because of the use of the Villa La Roche as the Fondation
right,
Le Corbusier,
so
I could do
Corbusier
it.
is the same, and we have a
So
whole
that
lecture
you
about
know.
Corbusier. Yeah,
Let's
and-
be clear on that.
But I think more.
I'm not correct. You take a picture of a building and use it for publication of an actual building.
Yeah.
You have to ask permission for the architect.
For both the photographer and then also the rights holder of the building itself. That depends on what country you're in. United States doesn't have that, but because this is streaming worldwide, we did have to take those in consideration. Yeah. Oh.
So one offhand comment is, I think we also need to think about just the phenomenology of like having to grab a microphone to be videotaped to say stuff that we're going to put on the web and say that this is a valuable conversation. So there's a whole set of things going on here too. But I was going to say, I think the manual textbook analogy helped me a little bit think about what operations within architectural education can be codified into textbooks and manuals, and what courses the MOOCs would wind up taking over or substituting for in architectural schools. So the design studio, it's still not going to happen to that, right? Mm-hmm. Or maybe aspects of it are, but I'm thinking just in the same way you divide out support classes versus the studio classes, I wonder if this reinforces a certain divide between the courses that are providing fixed amount of content and then the courses that are doing designerly work.
Mm-hmm. Atiyah? And then Atiyah.
So I had this question about, audiences, because I think that it's not only the case that students are listening to this stuff, it's also the case that there are, the continuing adult education, that kind of thing. And so it's also a question of expanding who the audience is for this kind of content, particularly with architecture, which is which is so much part of a cultural imagination that we want, that the people who would listen are not necessarily only students. So in a sense, I don't think it's only about replacing teachers with, or faculty with videos, but it's also about taking architectural information to a much, much bigger group of people. The second thing is that about what you were saying about time. You can, on YouTube, you can listen to something at twice the speed. And sometimes you have even smart speeding, which reduces the gaps. But so there's you can listen to these things while washing dishes. Mm-hmm. And what does it do to us as scholars who now can fill every moment of our time with more information? I feel the necessity to listen to lectures about things that are on the periphery of my knowledge base.
It's because you're at the beginning of the career. Let me reassure you, you don't read towards the end. That's a joke. But I do, that's, what you said is precisely what I had in mind. What does it do to the rhythm of life, to time, etc.? What if, listening to Shakespeare, we could rewind, go faster when we get bored, which is a little bit a problem today. Yeah. Ed wanted to say something, and then Fallon.
I just had 2.5 points. One is just the insistence on, or the emphasis on copyright this morning, which I think is quite interesting, makes me think of the text from Foucault we didn't discuss last night, which probably is newly relevant, is what is an author? Because it then implicates the author function in precisely the way it's being distributed in the manner Antoine has described. But more proximately, and this is picking up Antoine's interesting provocation that MOOCs would be a proper object of regard for actor network theory. It so happens, while doing my homework for this conference, I watched Bruno Latour's Tanner lecture at Yale called How Better to Register the Agency of Things. Tanner, by the way, was a biblical exegete, which I don't think is irrelevant. And this is one of these typical chalk and talk camera fixed on Latour at the front things. But he began his talk by discussing the fact that he had just made a MOOC called Scientific Humanities. And what I found interesting about it, he said he prepared for his MOOC by watching Frederick Wiseman's On Campus, or what he calls On Campus, which is at Berkeley. And I found that terribly interesting, specifically in regard to Antoine's comment about boredom, which is incredibly important aspect of, and I'm a great producer of boredom, so I'm invested in that idea, but the need to involve oneself in a Weissman documentary and the pacing of that, which is such an insistent part of the message to be delivered, it's intrinsic.
But Wiseman also believes that his movies are reality. He's one of those old school documentarians. So that is amazing that Latour was watching those.
It's just an interesting. I have. My only last thing I'll say is I have a slight opposite view of it from being in the front of the room. Fine, I know I'm boring, but I am amazed. And this comes from the fact that my father was maybe a medical doctor, but how frequently students have to leave the room to presumably go to the restroom, which is just on a metabolic level. They can't seem to make it through an hour and a half. So I'll just put that out there.
Fallon.
Sorry, let's go Fallon and then Sonia.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to kind of just offer up some kind of notes from the field, if you will, from the job market for the past few years, just that I think could help to contextualize this conversation, which I will focus on the question of equity, because it's a very interesting experience, especially as a person of color, to be on the job market with a Harvard degree and be applying to hold a position at schools outside of the Ivy League, schools, state universities, second-tier universities, universities that have maybe 4 or 5 full-time faculty and everyone else is a part-time faculty member. And part of what they're looking for is for access to the content that is delivered here on a regular basis for their students and for a kind of discursive engagement that might happen between myself and the members of that department, right? So there's 2 levels of education happening there. One is this continuing education, obviously for people who are already in the field. And there's some very strange dynamics there that we could get into maybe later, but there is a question always posed. Do you have online teaching experience, right? Is that something that they perhaps want to do in terms of expanding their own revenue sources as fiscally strapped universities? And then secondarily, there is this matter of, well, would you be comfortable in doing these kind of semi-open kind of courses that are more around you being this kind of ambassador for Harvard-esque knowledge of this field for members of instructors and so forth working at our kind of universities? I don't know how many times I was asked by deans, are you really sure you want to work for a university like ours or a university in a city like ours? And so I think that there's something to be said here for around this kind of diversifying of products that needs to be talked about in conversation with the diversity of the people delivering that product. So I don't know.
I completely agree.
That's actually it's great setup. So thank you.
Yeah,
so the word, to hear the word diversity, and I would like to say that we need to be bored in order to have this space, in order to develop plurality and diversity. And that's one of the things that I see endangered actually by courses like the MOOCs, because of course, you know, they will kind of distribute certain ideas and everybody will relate to those ideas. But how can we actually, and this goes back to what Marika was saying earlier, right, create those spaces that then actually give the opportunity to discuss maybe, and rather, which is basically, we need to be in the room for that. We need to kind of bodily inhabit space, I think, to be able to do that and not lose it. So this is an argument both for MOOCs, because we need to get information out there to as many people as possible, but it's also an argument for caution.
To be honest, if I may, just 2 minutes, one of the reasons behind the choice of this format for a conference was precisely to explore, you know, the idea that in some ways, you know, now that you tape more and more the conferences, the thing that becomes really interesting is actually to have a real conversation with real people in a room. And so that was one of the ideas lurking in our minds behind that strange format, because I think, you know, this might be one of the things you, of course it's film, but I think it's so much more interesting to be in the room part of the conversation. Erika?
In fact, my question has to do with that, with being in the room. One of the things I've really noticed, I think, over the past 15 years, and this has to do with grading and watching students learn, and here I'm talking about the sort of reception end, is the way that access to online, to Facebook while you're listening to a lecture, creates an intellectual mindset that it works against slow thought or slow thinking, and in fact promotes a kind of intellectual engagement that has to do with sound bites. And in the worst case scenario now, I've actually noticed a dramatic shift, if there are plagiarism cases, of how people plagiarize. Which is to say that what they will do is they'll search on the web and find fragments of sentences, you know, if they're in Michael's class and they have to write about Roland Barthes or something, and they will find fragments of sentences and literally piecemeal sort of stitch them together in a kind of odd palimpsest. And it was interesting at MIT, I noticed also that with undergrads and at Michigan, that there was another way of thinking that is sort of more like a palimpsest of sound bites. And that it intervenes actually in the way people can or cannot write, or can or cannot think, or the way they sustain a thought. And I wonder a little bit about, for example, simply note-taking, even if you're bored out of your mind, what it means to sit there for an hour and a half. And this is where the sort of demise of the lecture is sort of, in some ways, a tragedy to me, because it can be an extraordinary thing if you are in front of a charismatic person. It can be a deadly thing if you're not. But simply the art of extracting a sustained set of thoughts seems to me to be greatly at risk. It's one of my anxieties, at any rate.
Sure, John.
I mean, I think for maybe for those of us who haven't been teaching as long, it's interesting, Erika, like that was a baseline reality from the moment I started teaching. So for example, at UCLA, where I first started teaching, every undergrad paper had to be submitted through a piece of software called Turnitin, which gave you a statistical report of the amount of, essentially, of plagiarism in the paper. But just to tie it into maybe yesterday's conversation, I think at one point Timothy had mentioned that the impetus towards maybe a concentration on something like media or technics among my generation, for sure, is absolutely derived from conditions like this, like the demise of writing, or maybe even the demise of listening, or something like that. So I just want to put that on the table in terms of the relationship between maybe some of the things that were being said yesterday and some of the things that are being said today.
If I may just add something, I'm really struck by the fact that, you know, Michael is given these MOOCs, because having co-taught with you, Michael, I think one of the things that I find the most fascinating is when you are trying actually to think about what am I really thinking, which is one of your best Actually, this is one of your favorite coups, but which is also actually really, I often jokingly say you deliver on stage, like giving birth. And it's true that sometimes it provokes a level of anxiety looking at you and trying to see whether it's going to end up in a terrible way or not. You know, it's a pre-antibiotic operation. And I think that is lost in a MOOC, because in a MOOC, my experience.
She edits it out.
No,
yeah.
and my experience of the MOOC is, first of all, everything is cut into small sequences, because at a certain point we tend to, do a lot of gesture. We don't look on the camera. We lose the thread. So it's cut. It's atomized, and so you lose that possibility of the on stage, and a lot of other things like that, which have to do with the very link. By the way, the reason I'm saying that, I insisted a lot on the body, the link between thought and body, and that sometimes when I say you're giving birth, it's because you see the entire Michael Hayes toe to hair involved in delivering the final form of the thought, and that is lost. And I'm saying all the more that I'm not at all like that. Usually I often compare myself to a clockmaker, so usually the thing is already in place before I talk. But that's something that is lost. And a lot of things like that are lost. And to echo, can we still think in real time? And that's a little bit the problem for me, because I think one of the things you can do in a seminar, live, or a class is to think in real time. And to bring to the table things that were not on the paper.
If I were to use that exact phrase technically, I think you can turn that phrase around and say, the struggle right now is, can we think under the conditions of the techniques of real time?
Yeah.
Meaning, and this is the simultaneity you highlighted in your own paper, which is if you walk through these trays in the evenings, you will see multiple monitors set up. There will be a Netflix on one of the monitors. There will be a lecture playing on an inside window on another monitor. And I think one of the things we should probably talk about today is how does the history theory community take that on without being simply dismissive of it as a way of learning, because that's not going to, and I'm not saying that's what's happening here today, but it needs to be taken on seriously, because that's actually what's happening upstairs, and what kinds of thought processes are going through students' minds as that's going on.
Let's go to Fallon first. Okay.
Just on that note, I was sort of struck at how close the process you set up was to some things in architectural production. Like I've worked on, it's more common nowadays to do actually sort of video presentations, right? Like instead of submitting a bunch of boards, you submit a sort of presentation. And a lot of, for a competition, the design of the project will be happening with the design of the video, right, that's presenting it. And so it's interesting to see potentially let's say if it weren't all thought through at one stage and then sort of produced and edited at a different stage, like if the thinking through of the course were sort of going along with the production of the course, like the editing and all that, it would be bringing these two things actually more together.
Can I say real quick, I think it's important that, because what this is not the same as a course in person in a lecture. And I want to just re-articulate that. We're not talking about replacing like with like. So I think all of that is really important to keep in mind. And if there is something that has to do with demise of boredom or not being able to be in a room, it has to do with a whole swirl of factors, this being one of them, absolutely. But that this is not saying I'm a course. It's saying something else. And I think what you're saying is built into that, because if we're going to start producing work like that, we have to think like that. We're not producing a course. We're thinking something that's like a hybrid of a textbook with something else. And
Fallon, and then Alex. Yeah.
So I want to go back to this, like, what did you call it? Like a pyramid of labor of some kind that you spoke about earlier, which is that maybe not at this particular moment, but I can easily see how in 5 years, because this has happened in some other aspects of what goes on in design education, but in 5 years there becomes a informal privileging of those persons who are able to perform Michael Hayes style in this format, not just on camera, right, but in front of the classroom, and is well suited to collaborating with all of these new members of the pedagogical process. And I'm not saying that that's in and of itself a bad thing, but what we have yet to do in particularly really poorly in design education, schools of architecture and planning more broadly, is instructor evaluation. And the like peer-to-peer evaluation of how people perform pretty much happens at hiring and at tenure and promotion, like markers. And how do we go about, formally and informally evaluating individuals in a way that, yes, in some respects might resist the kind of capitalistic structure of MOOC production, and in other ways opens up some other new ways of addressing diversity and equity and inclusion in design education. So I feel like there is a responsibility amongst particularly standing faculty to take a proactive role in defining what the evaluative structures will be or should be for anyone participating at any level of that pyramid in these structures, whether it's a teaching fellow or a full-time tenured faculty member.
I would actually, if I may just, I'm wondering whether it's really a question of evaluation or rather having a space of freedom, of non-evaluating, because I think the danger is actually as soon as you begin to evaluate, you standardize performance. And I do think that history theory is one of the few remaining fields in which performance is not submitted to a metrics, etc. So I completely agree on the need, precisely, and I'm glad that finally it is revealed that somebody quoting Althusser is actually serving capitalism. So that's an interesting thing. But
I'll push back for a second, because I do think that there is an evaluative structure already happening, whether it's from how architectural education accreditations actually work in terms of how much resource allocation.
But that's also what we have to resist, because extending the evaluation process might actually backlash and might actually push even more towards the quest for performance, efficiency, monetary compensation, etc. That's a little bit my fear. Actually, I think we're getting invaded by metrics. You have the H-index, you have all these things, all these quotation index. We have actually probably, it would be extremely dangerous. But Alec wanted to talk, sorry. But I agree on the problem.
On similar themes, I suppose, and also spoken from, absolutely no experience and total naivete. But like two terms I'd like to introduce would be attention and consumption, I suppose. So, like, and in relation to boredom, and then the third term would be absorption. Like, what kind of and to bring up the question of resistance, like, what kind of resistance is required to absorb something, right? And then also, what kind of things are we trying to convey or absorb? Which comes to Lisa's kind of repeated assertion, which I think is very interesting, but I don't quite, because you're saying it's not a course, it's not this, but then what is it? Is it? I just keep thinking of like kind of BBC videos that they pick out the most telegenic professor or whatever, however you define that. And they, give a 6-hour, Simon Schama, and it's a kind of, it's a form of consumption. So is the role, and again, this is naivete and kind of ideal, but is the role of the professor to give people what they want? Or is it in the soundbite-like thing, but a Jenny Holzer kind of thing, to protect people from what they want?
That said, it was always a problem, in the 17th century in the Dutch, in the Netherlands, pastors had to be good looking. Because how could you preach that God is wonderful if you're too ugly? That was actually a very debated question, and there is always, the truth is we never talk about it, but the nice looking telegenic professor does have an advantage. For example, you couldn't film somebody with brown eyes on a concrete background, whereas the piercing two blue eyes of Michael look just perfect.
So
that's body.
So just a short comment, and then Melanie after me. I'm always struck in these conversations when we're talking about new media that we're sort of grappling with, or new opportunities or challenges that we're trying to sort through. The kinds of statements that go something like "This is happening," or "I see the demise of X," and I want us to be very careful about what we accept as given in this context. If we think that boredom is an essential aspect for creative thought, or for kind of counter thinking, or any of those things, if we think that a kind of a pace, a slowness is important, then I think we can no longer assume that that's built into the structure of our pedagogical system. We have to be active about inculcating it. And we may actually have an opportunity when it comes to MOOCs that certain things are being sort of exported, if you like, or certain things are being imported that allow us to be more thoughtful about what really matters pedagogically. And that includes things that we've taken for granted for too long, systems that we haven't examined. So just, when we say, this is what's happening upstairs, if that's not what we want, or if we want something different, or if we want to exploit that in a particular way, then let's design it.
I'm gonna hitch my wagon really briefly on that. The fact is that is happening upstairs, but it's also true that our seminars have 30 people in them. In other words, people are drawn to seminars. They are drawn to these sort of long, enduring dissections of texts and slowing things down. In other words, I like to think of this as a dialectic, not as a given. The piece of the sort of symbol-like, of life is taking us over, and that actually pedagogy has multiple forms, and the success of the seminar is the place, I think, where we can sort of grab back, as it were.
Absolutely.
Just to tap onto that, while I'm totally on board, having been one of the teaching fellows that's like the hard copy version, like that supplements this digital thing, is that what I've noticed with the students is that, yes, there is the value of slow thought, and I'm totally on board with that, but there is also the value that I've noticed in this obsessiveness to be able to rewind and go back to, like, students would email me and be like, Michael said at minute 33.12, right? And then we would actually re-go through the video multiple times in order to be like, okay, so we'll watch it together, and then, do you see what I mean? So there is the power of, like, rewinding, which I think we're not quite, we're talking about fastness as if it's a teleological, it's just going forward, but there is also the, the moment where we go back. Yeah, and they would quote you at minute 1.12.
Although I would take the exact counterpoint.
Right.
What about things which are wasted? And it is so important that sometimes things are irreversible. That makes me nervous, actually, your example, because I would hate sometimes things to be rewinded, because I think it happens in time, etc. Which is also why I was at the beginning a little bit reluctant about filming this thing today, because I was wondering. But there are some things, you simply want them to disappear. What's the name already of this app in which you can post things?
Snapchat.
Snapchat.
So you want Snapchat version?
There is a Snapchat dimension to teaching. Right. Otherwise, you're creating vampire, living dead. Thought is partly, some thought at least are partly produced in the moment. If you resurrect them, you're creating a very unnatural creature.
Right,
the vampire of a thought.
Yeah.
But having been in your lectures physically and having watched these, to me, it was very clear, like, it actually, the two things go hand in hand in a way that it does make more clear what you're saying. I mean, there is there are some things that I was confused in a physical lecture that are so much clearer on the MOOC. And
but I would argue actually being confused and understanding only 80% of what the professors say is actually a good activity. It forces you to invent the last 20%. No, I'm not completely joking.
Yeah.
I think this is actually a different with math. In math, you have to understand 100%. In the humanities, you have actually to reinvent 20% of what was said. And actually, it worries me a little bit that we're creating people who want really to have completely understood what we say. First of all, because we don't understand probably also 20% of what we say, to be completely honest. And that's part of the creative process of interaction.
I get that.
You see what I mean?
But Antoine, remember what you said to Timothy yesterday, for aggregate to have that platform against which to resist, they need to have something to be like, did he actually mean this when he said this?
Okay, but then it transforms, the course into, and we're back to the textbook analogy, it transforms it into a text. The text is precisely something that is fixed, and I agree you can reinterpret it, but it's fixed. And we're back to the old opposition that Derrida loved so much between speech and writing.
We go to Patricio and then to Jorge.
Just to follow up on what's been said, I think what's very important is to ask where are these people being created? Because I don't think that Harvard is at a crisis of the demise of the classroom, after all. And this was an article in the New York Times a while back, say that people will still want to go to Harvard or Yale or, to all the...
We're a luxury brand.
Right, to the brands. People will still physically want to go there. What they were arguing is that the online course will be the demise of public education. And that's really where the threat, which is where these people will be actually
That's
created.
exactly one of my concerns. It's clear. I have the impression we're Hermes.
Yeah.
We're a luxury brand for the happy few, etc. So we're not challenged. Actually, we will still be paid to be physically present for, like a luxury spa.
But then will affect, as was mentioned here, then either
Absolutely.
the replication or the commodification of a brand-style education to actually try to then fill this void.
Conclusion. Let's go to Jorge, and this will probably be the last.
We have to make a break.
Yeah.
I just want to record, actually, because we naturally have been talking all this morning about the lecture format and perhaps a little bit about the seminar, because we are focused entirely on history theory. And something that I just thought as I was listening to the speculation about the impact on these new technologies on the experience of time and what it has done to the learning process, suddenly I actually realized that the other part that we will talk about later, but which is part of this discussion, which is the studio, how much it has changed it also, but in a very different and luckily, I think, positive way, the aspect of time. Because the studio is the most different type of teaching that we have in the school. It's a one-to-one, really, relationship. And it's mostly about a conversation, about a prepared thing that you have to, do before the class. And what has happened for all of us that remember what it was to design before, and as much as I love drawings, if you were doing a skyscraper and you wanted to change the proportion of the windows, you have to start all over again. And time was an impediment, in a way, sometimes of the progress of the ideas. That has really had the impact in which now, the alternatives to design are almost infinite. And it has allowed for me at least, more time and more material to discuss. It has it does not allow for the interaction that drawing together used to, but the conversations do get more in depth, and I think it's the impact is very positive in that respect. That's all. I just wanted to record this since we're talking about that,
yeah.
the time issue.
I'll have to end this. I just want to end it on two quick notes to the point of leaving carcasses. The Brunelleschi lecture on perspective was filmed by now 3 years ago, where I say that Brunelleschi probably turned his back to the baptistry and looked in a silver plate to draw it. There's a Japanese scholar just recently who made a very compelling argument that he used a camera obscura. Mm-hmm. So already there's a carcass on the film that I was probably wrong. And whether you have received it yet or not, you will. Harvard is launching what they're calling a micro masters in certain subjects, which means you take 3 online courses and you get a semester credit before you arrive to campus. So thank you.
Thank you. Just point of organization, we reconvene at 11:30 for the conversation on, the global history versus canon, another hot topic these days. And this afternoon we'll have the studio and history theory conversation. Thank you all.